Nobody at Garfield Veterans Rehabilitation Center wanted to fight for the man in room 7. The doctors called him a closed file, the administrators called him a cost problem, and the night staff called him difficult, because even flat on his back with no movement below his chest, his eyes could make a grown person look away. Welcome to Steady Badges Stories. If this one reaches you, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Room 7. Nathan Whitfield had been a warrant officer with Joint Task Force 2 for 11 years before an IED in the Arghandab Valley removed him from the life he'd known. He was 44 years old. He had shoulders built like a river lock gate. He had a service record nobody at Garfield had clearance to read. Now he needed someone to turn his head. He needed help swallowing. He needed positioning every 2 hours so the pressure sores wouldn't start. To Dr. Gareth Fenn, the neurologist who ran the unit, that meant finished. To Garfield's administration, it meant expensive. To Tessa Drummond, it meant something wasn't right. She stood near the medication trolley in bright blue scrubs that sat loose on her lean frame. Her light hair was pulled back into a knot that never quite held by the end of a shift. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that tended to stay on things longer than most people were comfortable with. Quiet nurses lasted longer on wards run by proud physicians. Tessa knew the rule. She had survived worse rules than this one. She was watching Nathan's left hand. His index finger had moved, barely. A slow press against the mattress rail, pause, then 2 short taps, a pause again. Dr. Fenn stood at the foot of the bed addressing his residents. Document no progression in voluntary motor function, he said. Continue passive range of motion. Family consultation this week for transition planning. A resident named Ross shifted his weight. Nurse Drummond flagged some positioning data. Blood pressure drops when? Fenn glanced at her. Yes, she flags things. A few people smiled, just enough. Tessa kept her face still. Fenn continued. This patient sustained a complete spinal cord injury at T4, 8 months post-injury. No functional recovery, no surgical pathway. He has a distinguished service record and a ward full of people mistaking grief for clinical evidence. He tapped the tablet in his hand. What he needs is appropriate long-term placement. Nathan blinked once, hard. Tessa stepped closer to the bed. His blood pressure drops whenever his head is elevated past 30 degrees. Fenn's expression didn't change exactly, but it sharpened. Are you suggesting an unconscious patient is self-reporting through his vital signs? I'm suggesting the positioning data is consistent enough to warrant another look. Another look at what, specifically? At whether his injury is complete. The room went still. A respiratory therapist stopped writing. Ross stared at a point between Tessa and the wall. Everyone in Fenn's unit knew the rule. You did not suggest a misdiagnosis in front of trainees. You did not make the attending look careless. You certainly did not do it twice in 3 weeks. Tessa had already done it twice. Fenn stepped toward her. Miss Drummond, this is a neurological rehabilitation service. Intuition doesn't outrank imaging. Tessa felt something old move inside her. The smell of diesel and cold mountain air. The weight of a rescue pack on her back in the dark. A voice in her earpiece saying the landing zone was compromised. Her own hands, steady despite everything, doing what needed doing. She put it away. Yes, doctor. Fenn lowered his voice. You've been here 9 months. In that time you've questioned 2 discharge plans, 1 medication protocol, and now my prognosis. I've seen what happens when nurses become emotionally invested in veteran patients. They begin to see recovery where there is none. It isn't compassion. It's projection. Nathan's eyes moved to hers. The look wasn't pleading. It was something closer to a command. Do something. She forced herself to stay still. She was a nurse here. That was all. She had no rank, no call sign, no radio channel, no aircraft overhead. She was Tessa Drummond, 38, unremarkable, useful, invisible. That was the version of herself she had built deliberately for the past 5 years. Fenn leaned over the bed. Mr. Whitfield, it's natural to resist this kind of news. We'll help your family understand the options available to you. Nathan's lips moved, no sound. Tessa saw it before anyone else. She moved closer. Nurse Drummond. Fenn's voice carried a warning. Nathan's eyes locked onto hers, his lips moved again. A breath came out, a fragment of something. Ridge. Tessa stopped. The word hit her somewhere below language, not the syllable itself, what lived inside it. Ridgeline. The call sign belonged to one man from a joint operation that had never officially happened. Ridgeline had kept the beacon live with a fractured femur and a tourniquet he'd applied one-handed while his team was pinned. Ridgeline had guided her aircraft in through cloud and mountains. He had been the voice she'd followed down into the dark. Panjwai District. Classified extraction. No names in any civilian file anywhere. Nathan Whitfield should not have known her face. She had come out of the dark in a helmet and flight suit, but his eyes knew her. They had the particular recognition of someone who had spent a long time wondering whether a face was real or something his mind had built to survive. Fenn folded his arms. What did he say? Tessa didn't answer. Nathan's throat worked. He was fighting his body, fighting the silence, fighting everything Fenn had spent 8 months building around him. She leaned close. She said it quietly, just to him, Ridgeline. His eyes went bright, not tears exactly, something deeper than that, coming up from somewhere that had been sealed for a long time. A tremor moved across his jaw, barely there, enough. Tessa straightened. She looked at Fenn. He needs new imaging. Absolutely not. His injury presentation may not be complete. The autonomic responses are consistent with. Miss Drummond. Fenn's voice had gone flat. You will not direct clinical decisions based on a patient's vocalization and your personal interpretation of his affect. That is not medicine, that is theater. Nathan blinked hard, twice, 3 times. Tessa read it as clearly as she would have read a radio signal. She watched his finger press against the mattress rail. Slow, deliberate. The monitor alarmed. Heart rate 44, blood pressure 88/52. Tessa looked at the pillow. It had shifted during the exam. His chin was angled slightly forward, just enough. His neck is extended, she said. Fenn barely looked. Vagal response, he's had them before. Tessa reached for the pillow. Fenn's hand came out and caught her wrist. Not hard, just present, just enough to be clear about who gave orders here. The room went cold. Tessa looked at his hand, then at his face. Something very old and very trained in her went completely quiet. Distance, grip angle, exit options. No, this was a hospital. She was a nurse. Move your hand, doctor. The monitor screamed, heart rate 38, oxygen saturation 91. His grip didn't move, she moved past it. She repositioned the pillow, supporting Nathan's neck with both hands, bringing him to neutral alignment. Heart rate 35, said the nurse at the station. Tessa's voice changed, not louder, lower. Ross, call rapid response. Vivian, get the airway cart, page neurosurgery, and tell them possible cervical compression with autonomic collapse. Nobody moved for half a second. Now, she said. They moved, all of them, including the ones who answered to Fenn. The rapid response team arrived with the controlled noise of people who knew what they were doing. The charge nurse, Vivian Cho, took one look at the monitor and looked at Tessa. Bradycardia with positional trigger. Acute, he responded to repositioning. Possible dynamic compression, cognition intact, watch the blink pattern. Fenn cut in. This is a chronic injury, this is not an emergency. Vivian looked at Nathan. Mr. Whitfield, blink once if you can hear me. 1 blink. Blink once if your neck is painful. 1 blink. The room changed again. Fenn said, I did not authorize medication. Vivian had already drawn the atropine. She looked at the monitor, then at Tessa. Tessa said, 0.5 milligrams IV. Vivian gave it. Heart rate climbed, 36, 41, 48. Nathan's eyes stayed on Tessa. She held his head and did not let go, and that was the only thing she had to offer right now, and it was enough. The neurosurgery fellow arrived 7 minutes later, irritated, breathless, reading the room the way people did when they knew something had happened before they got there. What am I looking at? Fenn started, a miscommunication. Tessa spoke over him. High-level spinal patient, autonomic collapse triggered by neck extension. 7 days of documented blood pressure, drops on position change. Blink communication confirms pain. Prior imaging may have missed dynamic compression or evolving epidural pathology. He needs MRI with strict neutral precautions. The fellow looked at Nathan. Blink once for yes, do you understand me? 1 blink. Neck pain? 1 blink. Worse with your head forward. 1 blink. The fellow turned to Fenn. Why wasn't neurosurgery consulted before? Fenn said, no clinical indication. Tessa held out her notes. 7 days of documented readings, every blood pressure drop, every positioning incident, the blink pattern she had logged 3 times without a response from anyone above her. The fellow read fast, his expression shifted. Get him to MRI. Fenn went white. They moved Nathan out of room 7 on a gurney. Veterans watched from doorways as they passed. An older man in a wheelchair raised 2 fingers off his armrest. Nathan couldn't return it. His eyes filled instead. Tessa walked beside him. Near the elevator, Fenn fell into step alongside her. You know 1 old call sign and a few vital signs, and you think that makes you part of something. Tessa looked straight ahead. I was part of something. Ross's head came up sharply. Vivian stopped pushing the cart. The elevator opened. Tessa rolled Nathan inside. The doors began to close. She looked at Fen through the narrowing gap. "Write whatever you want in my file," she said, "after he's stable." The doors shut. The MRI suite was cold and precise and indifferent to everything that had just happened in the ward. Tessa stood beside Nathan's stretcher while the neurosurgery fellow, Dr. Sanna Prabaker, reviewed the pre-scan notes. "Ridgeline," Prabaker said quietly, not looking up. "Is that from something?" Tessa looked at the equipment. "From somewhere cold." Prabaker understood enough not to push. The scan ran. Images appeared on the screen through the glass. Old trauma, scar tissue, the long evidence of what the Arghandab Valley had done to him. And then something else, a shadow, small, specific, at T3, not T4, in the wrong place for the original injury classification. Prabaker leaned forward. "Stop there." The image held. Her expression changed. She clicked to another angle. The shadow remained. "That's not artifact," Prabaker said. Fen, who had followed them, said, "It could be." "It isn't." Another click. "Epidural collection, probably inflammatory, possibly hemorrhagic. Small enough that the original read would have missed it if they weren't looking." Tessa looked through the glass at Nathan, trapped inside the machine, unable to do anything but wait. She remembered him differently. 7 years ago, his voice had been steady even then, even with the femur, even with everything. He had stayed on the radio until she reached him. He had marked the landing zone with a chemical light tied to a rock, waving it in the dark so she could find him. Ridgeline had found her a way down. She was going to find him a way back. Dr. Kwame Asante arrived 20 minutes later with the particular tired competence of a surgeon who had seen enough to know when something mattered. He reviewed the images in silence. He stopped at the same frame. "Who identified this pattern?" "Nurse Drummond," Prabaker said, "from vital sign trends and positional responses." Asante looked at Tessa. 7 days of documentation? "Yes." He nodded. "The cord may have been compressed since before initial classification, if the inflammatory lesion predates the staging exam." Fen said, "We cannot base surgical intervention on a nursing hypothesis." Asante looked at him steadily. "I'm basing it on imaging and a 7-day data trail. The nursing hypothesis is what got us to the imaging." He turned to Tessa. "What do you need?" "Consent, surgery, and Dr. Fen out of this room." Asante almost smiled. He didn't quite, but it was close. Obtaining consent was harder than it should have been. Fen argued Nathan couldn't meaningfully consent through blinking. The ethics board wanted documentation. Administration wanted risk analysis. Tessa stayed with Nathan while the hospital argued over his body in conference rooms. His pressure dipped twice. Each time she corrected his position and talked him through it. "Do you remember the chemical light?" she said. "You tied it to a rock." His lips moved, no sound, but his eyes said yes. "That rock was the ugliest landing zone I ever came down on." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, almost. Fen appeared in the doorway. "Miss Drummond, your suspension is formalized as of now." Nathan's eyes went sharp. Tessa kept her voice even. "He communicates with me." He blinks. Any nurse can observe blinking. "You have had 7 days of documented evidence that this man's injury was not what you classified it as. 7 days. You didn't order imaging. You didn't consult neurosurgery. You scheduled him for transfer to a private facility." She paused. "Which facility?" A pause, small, but there. Meridian Neuro Recovery. Tessa knew the name. Meridian had opened 2 years ago with significant investment from Blackwood Defense Systems, a Canadian defense contractor with a medical technology division. They needed candidates with high-profile military service records and complex spinal presentations, decorated JTF2 operators whose cases attracted public attention and government funding. The cold moved through her again. "How many patients have you transferred to Meridian?" she asked. Fen's expression closed. "That's not relevant." Asante appeared in the doorway behind him. "Ethics cleared modified consent by Blink Communication. Surgery is scheduled for 1700. You're off the case pending administrative review." Fen went still. "This is my unit." "It's the hospital's unit," Asante said. "Walk away, Gareth." The hallway that evening had changed. Word moved through hospitals the way it always did, not through announcements but through the people who knew every face in every ward. Veterans lined the corridor as Nathan was moved toward surgery. Older men with walkers. A young woman with a prosthetic arm who stood very straight. A man in his 70s who simply stood with his hand over his heart. Nathan could not acknowledge them. His eyes did. At the surgical elevator, Fen stepped into the path of the gurney one last time. "You don't get to do this." Tessa stopped. The hallway went quiet behind her. "I'm not doing this to you," she said. "I'm doing it for him." Fen leaned close, voice down. "You know one old call sign, and you think that makes you part of something classified. You're a nurse. You were always just a nurse." Tessa's face went still. Not the still of someone suppressing emotion, the still of someone trained to be completely quiet inside themselves before they acted. "You're right that I was always a nurse," she said. "I was also a combat search and rescue technician with 424 Transport and Rescue Squadron. I was on the team that pulled Ridgeline out of a valley you will never have clearance to read about. And right now I am the person standing between your patient and the worst decision you have made in 8 months of making bad ones." Ross stared. Vivian stared. Fen had no clean answer for any of it. The elevator opened. Nobody stopped Tessa from rolling Nathan inside. As the doors closed, Nathan's lips moved. She leaned down. He pushed the word out through everything his body could no longer do. Cairn. Her call sign. The one she had buried when she left the uniform. Named by her crew after she climbed back into a burning Cormorant helicopter twice, because equipment needed clearing before anyone else could. A cairn was a pile of stones you built to mark a path so others didn't get lost. Her squadron had found it accurate. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 5 years. She pressed her hand flat against the gurney rail. "Sleep, Ridgeline," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." The surgery took 4 hours and 17 minutes. Asante relieved the epidural collection, decompressed the cord at T3, and found inflammatory tissue that did not match the original injury presentation. He took samples. He found evidence of vascular involvement consistent with what Tessa had suspected from 7 days of positioning data that nobody had listened to. She stayed in the surgical suite until she was told, firmly, that she was in the way. She scrubbed out and stood in the corridor, with her hands pressed against the wall, and breathed the way she had been taught to breathe, when there was nothing left to do but wait. A tall woman in Canadian Forces dress uniform appeared at the end of the corridor. She walked with the economy of someone who had spent a career communicating with their body instead of their voice. Drummond. Tessa turned. Colonel Harker. Colonel Judith Harker had been commanding officer at 427 Special Operations Aviation Squadron during the years when Tessa and Nathan had been working in the same operational space without officially knowing each other. She stopped in front of Tessa and looked at her the way people looked at things they had thought were gone. "He called for Cairn when they prepped him for anesthetic," Harker said. "That's how we knew you were here." Tessa said nothing. Harker looked at the OR doors. Blackwood Defense is Meridian's primary investor. Fen has been a paid clinical consultant for Blackwood's neural rehabilitation program for 2 years. He needed candidates with complete SCI classifications and decorated military profiles. Whitfield's file was exactly what the program needed. Fen hadn't seen a patient, he had seen a grant, a research credit, a decorated JTF2 operator whose progress, or intentional lack of it, could be tracked and published and funded. For that to work, Nathan had to stay classified as permanently complete. "Pharmacy has been flagged as well," Harker continued. "There are sedation records in Whitfield's file that don't match nursing notes from 3 separate nights." Tessa's chest tightened. He was sedating him without orders. "It appears so. VA police are being briefed." Fen didn't wait for them. By the time Asante came out to tell Tessa that the cord had been compressed and not destroyed, that there were preserved pathways, that there was a chance, Fen had cleared his office and was gone. Security found his car missing from the staff parkade. They found him 40 minutes later in the visitor structure off Bayview, beside a black SUV with Meridian plates, and he had Nathan's wife beside him. Bridget Whitfield had come in for the surgery and been intercepted in the lobby by a man who told her there was paperwork needing her signature before an evening deadline. She was 41 years old and had been holding on alone for 8 months, and she had believed him because desperation made people believe things. Tessa ran. Not because anyone directed her, because Harker said parkade and Tessa was already moving before the sentence finished. She came around the concrete pillar and saw Fen with his hand on Bridget's arm and the SUV door open, and a man in the driver's seat who was not hospital staff. His posture was wrong. Everything about the scene was wrong, in the precise way. That wrong things felt different from far away when you had been trained to see them. Fen saw her. His face did something complicated, relief and hatred and fear, all present at once. "This is your fault," he said. Tessa stopped 15 feet away, hands visible. "Let her go. She needs to sign the transfer consent, that's all this is. Nathan is out of surgery. The cord was compressed and not destroyed. He has preserved pathways." She looked at Bridget. "He's going to need time and the right people around him. You didn't do anything wrong by coming here." Bridget's face broke open. "Don't listen to," Fen started. "She's right," said Harker, who had come around the other pillar with 2 VA police officers behind her. Fen looked at the officers, then at the SUV. The driver's door opened. The man inside started to get out. Tessa moved. 3 steps. She came in at an angle Fenn hadn't tracked, swept his grip from Bridget's arm, turned his wrist into a lock against his own momentum, and brought him down to the concrete with the particular controlled efficiency of someone who had done this in darkness and altitude, and wind coming off mountains at 60 kilometers an hour. Fenn made a sound. Bridget fell toward Harker, who caught her. The driver ran, got 6 steps before one of the officers caught him against a concrete pillar. Tessa held Fenn until the second officer arrived. Then she let go, she stepped back, she breathed. "My wrist," Fenn said from the ground. "It'll hold," Tessa said. Harker looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but contained something that functioned like one. Tessa looked at the parkade ceiling. 4 counts in, 4 hold, 4 out. She had not heard her call sign from a living person in 5 years. She had not moved like that in 4. It felt exactly the same as it always had, like the truest language her body knew. At 2200, Nathan was awake enough to have the breathing tube out. Bridget sat beside him with his right hand in both of hers, and the room held the particular quiet that followed things that had almost gone very differently. Tessa stood near the foot of the bed. Nathan's voice came out wrecked and thin. "Bridge." Bridget bent over him. His eyes found Tessa over his wife's shoulder. She stepped forward. "You sound terrible." It took a moment. "You look worse." Bridget laughed through tears. Tessa didn't exactly smile, but something in her face opened. Nathan swallowed. "There was a lad," he said, "on the extract." Tessa went still. "Connor Bright, Bravo element, he made it out. He wanted you to know." Tessa looked at the blanket. Connor Bright had been the youngest man on the Panjwai extract. She had applied a chest seal to him one-handed in the dark while Ridgelane called in the aircraft. She had not known if he survived until this moment. "He's in Petawawa now," Nathan said. "Still in, finished his jump course last year." Tessa covered her mouth with one hand, just for a second. She permitted herself that. Harker looked away. Asante studied the monitoring equipment with great interest. Nathan's right fingers moved, a small curl, then his left hand, barely one twitch. Asante was beside him in a moment. "Do that again." Nathan's face tightened with concentration, his left index finger lifted once. Asante looked at Tessa. "That was absent on admission today." "Document it," Tessa said. Nathan's eyes moved to the dark window. His reflection looked back at him. Something passed across his face that she recognized from the mountain, from that night. The expression a person had when they understood they might survive after all. "Not finished," he said. Tessa came and stood beside him. "No," she said, "not even close." 3 weeks later, Nathan Whitfield stood for 12 seconds between parallel bars in the physiotherapy suite. His knees shook. Bridget was there. His brother Declan was there. Tessa stood at the end of the bars in her bright blue scrubs. Nathan's face held the concentration of someone moving a mountain by hand. 12 seconds, he said when he sat back down. 12 seconds, Tessa agreed. The investigation into Fenn took 3 months and produced a report nobody at Garfield was comfortable reading, but everyone read anyway. Forged sedation records, an undisclosed financial relationship with Blackwood Defense, falsified consent documents prepared for Meridian's trial program, dated to a period when Nathan could not have agreed to anything. Fenn lost his license. Blackwood's medical division lost its Veterans Affairs contract. The private security contractor from the parkade produced a second report, which produced a parliamentary question, which produced a standing committee, which produced the particular noise that serious things made before the news moved on. What didn't move on was the protocol change. Every veteran with a catastrophic spinal classification at any VAC-affiliated facility in Ontario now received a second neurological review before prognosis became permanent. The nurses on the unit called it the Ridgeline Review. Nathan didn't know this until Vivian told him 6 weeks after surgery. He spent a moment looking at the wall with his jaw tight before he said, "Thank you," in a way that sounded like he meant several things at once. Harker arrived at Tessa's locker on a Thursday morning with a sealed envelope. "From Connor Bright," she said. "He said you'd know what it was about." Tessa opened it in the locker room after Harker had gone. Inside was a note, handwritten, "Cairn. You held the channel open long enough for all of us to get out. That doesn't go away just because you took the uniform off. Stop pretending you left. Bright." She sat on the bench for a while. Then she folded the note carefully and placed it in her locker beside a photograph Harker had also brought. A group image from 424 Squadron, taken somewhere flat and dusty, everyone squinting into the sun. She was in the back row. She looked younger and harder and more certain. She was still her. Garfield opened the Veterans Neurological Advocacy Program the following spring. The hiring committee, after a long meeting Tessa was not invited to, decided that the person who had already been doing the job without the title or the pay might as well have both. She wore bright blue scrubs on the first day. She always wore bright blue scrubs. She told the assembled staff, "No patient in this program will need a decorated service record to earn proper care." That should have always been true. It wasn't. We're making it true now. Nobody at Garfield looked away from her when she said it. A year later, Nathan walked across the rehabilitation courtyard. One cane. Bridget on his right. He moved slowly and precisely, the way people moved when they were paying attention to every part of something that had almost not existed. At the end of the courtyard, he stopped in front of Tessa and held out a faded patch. Worn cloth, the stylized wave of the 424 Squadron crest, the kind of thing that lived in the bottom of a kit bag for years. "Connor asked me to return it," Nathan said, "when you stopped running." Tessa took it. She pinned it inside her locker beside the note and the photograph, in the space between her spare scrub top and the door. A small archive of things that had happened, that she had spent a long time pretending hadn't. She never promised anyone they would walk. She promised she would not let them disappear in silence. Nathan never called himself healed. He was honest about what he could do on a given day and what he could not, and he found that precision more useful than either optimism or despair. What they both knew was the word written in marker on the small whiteboard. Tessa kept at the nurse's station, unchanged, since the first morning she'd arrived in her bright blue scrubs, and started paying attention to things nobody else was watching. Not finished. And every morning, in a unit that had once mistaken silence for hopelessness, that was enough to begin.